This is the first roundtable today, and our discussions will be in the disability in the history of eugenics. And my name is Phillip Thurtle. I have the privilege of teaching in the Comparative History of Ideas program, as well as in the Department of History at the University of Washington. We have 4 very talented scholars who come in with interesting perspectives on the relationship of disability in the history of eugenics. And how I would like to proceed is to give each of these scholars 10 minutes to discuss their work, and then after they present their work, open up for dialogue with you, and then pass microphones amongst the audience so then you can start a conversation with our panelists. All right? It is my great privilege to introduce our first panelist, which is Mark Largent, who is an assistant professor at James Madison College at Michigan State University. Mark focuses on the history of biology and medicine, including the evolution-creation debates and the eugenics movement in Oregon. In 2007, he published his very interesting monograph, Breeding Contempt, The History of Coerced Sterilization in the United States. Mark.
You want to behind the podium?
Podiums should be fine.
Good morning. Thank you for the conference and for attending, and especially for all of the work that many of you did, especially Joanne. Summarizing the history of eugenics internationally, nationally, and locally in 10 minutes is a startling feat. Considering the heterogeneity of what we mean when we say eugenics and the number of different people and in different contexts in which the word is used, Joanne's summary of it was incredibly accurate. There's no way I could have done any better than that. And in fact, usually when I hear people describing these histories in such broad terms, I sit there and sort of check off, well, that's not quite true. Well, that's not quite right. And she's dead on right. So I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say. I think I want to do things at the extremes then. I want to talk in a very abstract way, briefly about eugenics and sterilization, and then I want to talk in an extremely specific way about its function in Washington State. We use the terms eugenics and coerced sterilization almost interchangeably often. I mean, we've certainly done it so far this morning. When we look at the materials that have been produced and are on display, you see the mingling of these two things. And Joanne's right, it's very heterogeneous. It includes people on the political left and political right. It included and continues to include topics ranging from immigration restriction to birth control to education reform, international relations issues, developmental issues. It's so incredibly broad that the term eugenics really only has one meaning. It's bad. When we use the term eugenics, we typically use it as a slur. And that status as a slur emerged in the United States in the late 1960s, between about 1968 and 1972. Prior to that, eugenics really didn't have that sort of nasty connotation that we associate with it today. If we think about eugenics as a general heading with these things like immigration restriction and education reform and coerced sterilization underneath it, another way to sort of turn it over is to put your main heading being compulsory sterilization. And then look at, under the heading of compulsory sterilization, there were actually 4 different fundamental objectives being sought by the people who were advancing compulsory sterilization. One was certainly eugenic, although that seems to be really only as a policy issue. That is, legislatures and authors used eugenic motivations quite frequently to justify compulsory sterilization laws and compulsory sterilization procedures. When we look at it in practice, as Joanne suggested, it's even more heterogeneous. Eugenics is there and in the background, but by and large, that the individuals who were targeted for sterilization were targeted for either therapeutic, maintenance, or punitive reasons. And that eugenics was at best a justification rather than a motivation. In Washington, the scholarship that's been done by people like Christine Manganaro has suggested that many of the sterilizations that were done at places like Western State Hospital were done because they were trying to give women the ability to control fertility. when we look at the records of W.N. Keller, who was the superintendent of the state hospital, we see that there were very rarely eugenic rationales offered. By and large, he said, these are people who are suffering with the capacity to procreate. And the sterilization procedures are a remedy for that, taking away their fertility. And she even found cases in which it's suggested, as people like Joanna Schoen has also found in the Carolinas, that women manipulated the system at times in order to gain access to sterilization operations. Because remember, it's illegal to have yourself sterilized in the United States. That is, you cannot have access to a voluntary sterilization operation in the United States until well into the 1950s. So what some of these people were doing were manipulating the system using the eugenic rationales in order to gain access to sterilization operations. And Joanna Schoen has done a nice job showing that. But the existence of these laws were much more paternalistic than that. The other two reasons were maintenance. These people who were targeted for sterilization were often targeted for it because their fertility was considered a problem, either because they were on state support, state welfare support, and having children would increase the welfare burden, or because sexually sterilizing them was considered a way to deal with overt sexual problems that people who ran these institutions saw. And finally, its punitive nature is extremely obvious in Washington and in Oregon. The people who were targeted and the laws that were constructed had an explicit punitive aspect to them. And Washington's one of the few states that had that overt, I would say it was covert in most places, but Washington had an overt punitive aspect to its sterilization laws. That's talking about it in a very sort of broad brush way. Let me give what I think is a kind of duty of a more workaday historian, like I consider myself, and that, like, specifically, what are these laws? And there's really 3 laws and 2 court cases if you want to frame sterilization, compulsory sterilization laws in the state of Washington. Law was initially passed in 1909. It was not used for its first 2 years. It did not get used until 1911 with the court case of Peter Phelan, who was convicted of raping a child under the age of 10. He was given life imprisonment, and part of his, the judgment against him ordered him to lose the ability to procreate. He appealed his case to the Washington State Supreme Court, which very quickly rejected any claims of fact. Essentially, it found him guilty. He had committed this crime, and the punishment for this crime was imprisonment and possibly, according to the judge's wishes, sterilization. But the court spent a great deal of time considering the constitutional issues associated with Washington State's sterilization law. They concluded that it was not cruel and unusual punishment to sterilize someone. And they based that on the fact that the US Supreme Court had declared execution not cruel and unusual punishment. And they said, this is less than execution. It is neither cruel nor unusual. And they said in a line that's sort of frequently quoted, that sterilization as a medical procedure is no more serious than extracting a tooth. Which, if you had a tooth extracted in 1911, I think you would find that kind of serious. The law operated from 1911, it operated officially from 1909, but practically not until 1911. Until 1921, very, very, very infrequently used. And there was a lot of complaints about the fact that it was infrequently used. So much so that the state legislature in 1921 opened more broadly the law so that it didn't just focus on child rapists, child molesters, rapists, and habitual criminals, but after 1921 also included the feeble-minded, epileptics, insane, morally degenerate citizens, and sex perverts. In the work that I've done in Oregon, the morally degenerate and sex perverts refer to child molesters and rapists, but it also explicitly refers to people who we would today consider homosexual. Most of the sterilizations in Washington did not occur until the 1930s. There were a total of 685 officially recognized sterilizations. I think that number is is way off. There were far more sterilizations that occurred in hospitals than that, but they simply weren't reported. We know that we have names, dates, and procedures for about 64,000 sterilizations in the country. Most of us who've done very intimate work in states think that that number is about a quarter of the actual sterilizations. It's probably about a quarter of a million, because there were many, many unsanctioned sterilizations that went on, or unreported sterilizations that went on. And if you look at a place like Illinois, which never even had a sterilization law, we have evidence for several hundred sterilizations that happened there. That's just the direct evidence that we have. So we can say 65,000. Nationally, it's larger than that. We can say 685 in the state. It's probably larger than that. But we do know that it wasn't until the 1930s that in Washington that you really see sterilizations take off. You see the number of sterilizations in Washington in 1930 at 9. Only 9 sterilizations in the first 20 years of the law. But from 1930 to 1942, that number went up to 685. And that's a trend that parallels what's happening nationally. Some of the best records we have come from the superintendent of Western State Hospital in Steilacoom, W.N. Keller. And when we look at his records, we see almost no eugenic rationale whatsoever for his work. It's largely either therapeutic or for maintenance. As Joanne said, the law was challenged in 1942 in a Washington State Supreme Court case called the Hendrickson case. Hollis Hendrickson was judged insane and ordered into a mental institution and sterilized. His father appealed the case for him, saying among a number of other things that it violated the 14th Amendment, his right to due process, because the sterilization order was sort of tacked on to the question of whether or not he ought to be judged insane. The court ruled that the act did, in fact, violate citizens' right to due process, because there was not a separate hearing held to determine if the person ought to be sterilized. They also identified the fact that targets really needed special representation, that people who were targeted for this law ought to receive some kind of special help in representing themselves. From 1942 until 1961, there was no law on the books, no functional law on the books in Washington State. But just as Washington led the nation by passing the second sterilization law in the country, in 1961, it led the nation in what we consider a kind of second wave of sterilization laws. And the state legislature passed, and it was signed into law, a new law in 1961 that looked a lot like the original 1909 law. It targeted people who had been convicted of carnal abuse of a child under the age of 10, rape, or were considered habitual criminals. This law is still on the books. It was still on the books as of 2006. Last time I looked, I assume it's still there. It's no longer a functional law. It's no longer apparently used, but the remnants of it are still there. There's a new book out, came out about 2 months ago by Rebecca Kluchin with a great title, Fit to be Tied, that really looks at this second wave of sterilization activities. And we really have sort of two sort of different sterilization movements in this country. The first one that tended to focus on white people, tended to focus on cleaning up the white race, as we've talked about it in the teens and 20s. So the targets ended up being people who had were considered below average for physical and mental capacities and for moral capacities. We see in the act of that it originally targeted men and women evenly. It came to increasingly target women as we get into the 30s and 40s. The second wave of sterilization activity seemed to focus much more on minority members of state citizenry. So much so that in places like North and South Carolina, almost everyone who's sterilized is a member of a minority. So we can really think about these things as sort of two different things that has happened. And it's not over. In 1990, the Washington State Senate passed a bill that would have castrated sex offenders. It was passed in the midst of a very unpleasant sexual mutilation case of a 7-year-old boy. The Senate passed it, the House did not, but there was significant public support for it. And the House actually didn't pass it against public opinion, and it had to run counter to public opinion. Phil?
Thank you, Mark. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Jones. Stephen is the director of the Washington State University Research and Extension Center, at Mount Vernon. He is a plant geneticist and teaches the history and ethics of genetics and has researched how and when eugenics was taught in American universities. Stephen.
Thank you, Philip, and I'll start by saying it's an honor to be here this morning, and thank Joanne for inviting me. What shall we say of two people of defined impairment who are allowed to marry and rear children? It is a crime against every individual in the state, and if these physically degenerate are also morally degenerate, the crime becomes all the more appalling. Those words were written by Luther Burbank in 1907. If you like potato chips and French fries, he's the one that developed the russet Burbank potato. I'll start on a personal note, and as a plant breeder, I look back through my science to the breeders to gain knowledge, and it was the plant breeders and the animal breeders that started the eugenic movement in this country. It was the plant breeders and the animal breeders that popularized it through the land-grant institutions and the extension service and county and state fairs and so on. We started this movement as individuals and as a group. We've never taken responsibility or even acknowledged that we were at the forefront of this bad science. That haunts me as a plant breeder. One of my predecessors went to Harvard from WSU in the early teens. He was a wheat breeder. He came back with a Ph.D. in genetics and a membership in the American Eugenics Society. He studied with E.M. East at Harvard, who was basically, it was a eugenic mill at that time. I want to talk about universities as a key opportunity structure for the American eugenic movement. As a graduate student in the mid-1980s at the University of California at Davis, I took a History of Genetics course. It was offered by a geneticist. I learned that eugenics was a really quirky movement. In the 20s, no one took it seriously, and it went away very quickly. It certainly went away with the end of the Nazi regimes in the mid-1940s. It was not a quirky movement. It was practiced well beyond the 20s, and it didn't go away at the end of World War II. The founder, Charles Davenport, as Joanne mentioned, was a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He had a Ph.D. from Harvard. His main henchman, Harry Laughlin, had a Ph.D. from Princeton. These people were highly respected in my field of genetics. A 2004 paper in Theory and Society, a scientific journal, said that eugenics could scarcely speak its name by the mid-1940s. Okay? Eugenics could scarcely speak its name by the mid-1940s. That's a great quote, but it's quite incorrect. University of Idaho in 1947 was teaching a course titled Eugenics. University of Washington was teaching a course in 1949 titled Eugenics. You started teaching eugenics here in 1915, you ended in 1949. Well after World War II was over. Washington State University taught eugenics until 1950, and I'll give a little more detail on that. Texas A&M had a titled course up till 1952. Kansas State up till 1962. This is a course that's titled Eugenics. Cornell began teaching eugenics in 1912. They stopped in 1965. University of Minnesota stopped in 1966. Rutgers didn't start teaching eugenics until 1947. They stopped in 1972. Okay, that was one faculty member. They stopped teaching it because he died. In its prime, eugenics was taught at least 400 colleges and universities in the United States. In the 20s, 90% of the biology textbooks had a section on eugenics. 100% of the genetics textbooks had a section on eugenics. It was a major part of genetics. The syllabus from Brown, an Ivy League school from the 20s, lectures cited in the syllabus. One was the underworld of heredity. Another was heredity bogies. Another was racial poisons. Another was weeding the human garden. Okay, this is an Ivy League school, this being taught as a science. University of Pittsburgh course description for its course eugenics, human characteristics that require increased birth rate from the superior, and the eugenic aspect of various movements such as women's rights, immigration, and mothers' pensions. What about WSU? Okay. In researching for my course in the history of genetics, I thought, well, we probably taught it at WSU. You know, I thought we did. I went to the library and found out we started in 1920. We ended in 1950, and that frightened me. I thought, how could we be teaching it in 1950? That's when we did the research to find when the rest of the university stopped, and I found out we weren't as bad as some other schools. How did the description change for our course? It was zoology 61, the number remained the same the entire time. The professors, the department chair was, the last department chair when it was taught was still a member of the American Eugenics Society. The early professors were as well. In 1920, it was described as a study of the heredity of traits and characters of man. In 1929, the description was changed to a study of the heredity of traits and mental characters of man. And in 1946, after World War II, it was described as a study of the heredity of traits and mental characters of man and their relation to eugenic problems. At a time when eugenics could scarcely speak its name, it was used twice in a course title at Washington State University. How did it end? That was another thing that I was curious about. I thought, so we knew it came out of the course catalog in 1950. Why? So I went to the archives and I noticed that the libraries are one of the sponsors of this event, and I hope we can keep them around for a little longer. I went to the archives, looked at the old course, looked at the old faculty notes, and luckily the Department of Zoology did archive their faculty minutes. I was looking for a great debate among the faculty. There was none. I was looking for something. There was nothing other than the students didn't want to take it anymore. 1949, there were 12 students. 1956 had enrolled. They had a faculty meeting in January of 1950 and said, we don't have any students that want to take this anymore. That's not a direct quote, but it's pretty close. They retitled the course as Genetics and Heredity and moved on. It just, the way we say it is, in the end, it just ended, right? It just went away. The students didn't want to take it anymore. Eugenics continued to speak its name well past the 1940s on university campuses. We offered the opportunity structure to enable this. Hopefully a symposium like this will bring these facts to life. So thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Michael Rembis. Michael is a visiting scholar in the Departments of History and American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Excuse me. He specializes in the history of disability and the history of eugenics. His forthcoming book is Disabling Sex: Gender, Eugenics, and Juvenile Delinquency in the United States, 1890 to 1960. Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip, and thank you to the University of Washington and to Joanne. I know she did a ton of work pulling this together, and this is a really amazing event. I never thought when I started studying eugenics 13 years ago that I'd actually be at an event of this type. I think it bodes well for the discipline of disability studies, and also sort of for the study of eugenics and the history of eugenics. I want to talk more sort of theoretically, although I won't get too theoretical, about disability and its role in the history of eugenics, and also disability as a category of analysis in the history of eugenics. I think first, before we do that, we first need to realize or think about the idea that disability is not ahistorical. It's not something that just can be taken for granted. It has a history. And the way we think about disability and what is and is not a disability changes over time. And that is not to deny the material realities of living a disabled life or being perceived as disabled, nor is it to deny the embodiment of disability. It's just to say that the ways in which ideas about disability, change over time, and that in a sense disability is what some scholars might call socially constructed. And I think that this is one of the important things that disability studies and a disability studies perspective brings to the history of eugenics. When we look at the history of eugenics from a disability studies perspective, we can begin to think more critically about human variation and human difference. Interestingly, the centrality of disability often gets minimized or completely erased by scholars of eugenics. The victims of eugenics are usually portrayed as so-called normal, quote, normal people whose only fault was being poor or uneducated or recent immigrants. Or the victims of eugenics are assumed to be, quote, mentally retarded. But that label, that category is very, very rarely ever interrogated in any meaningful way. Or they're assumed to be diseased or quote, defective in some way. But then again, those categories are also very rarely sort of studied from any critical perspective. The state of being, the lives of individuals who became the victims of sterilization laws and other forms of eugenics are rarely interrogated and rarely unearthed and talked about and analyzed in any systematic way. In the end, disability as a category of analysis and as a lived experience is either erased or reified through things like the history of eugenics. When we begin to think more critically about disability and the social construction of various categories of disability, we can begin to write a very different history of eugenics. And a very different history of eugenics begins to emerge. When we look at the history of eugenics from a disability perspective, we can begin, I think, to write a more nuanced history of the people who are perceived to be disabled. One of the very important things that disability studies does is it really seeks to, it really seeks to tell history from the perspective of those individuals who were perceived to be disabled. This can often be very difficult because the types of sources they left behind are difficult to find, and in some cases difficult to sort of decipher, or they simply don't exist. But they're there if we look hard enough. The historian Douglas Banton at the University of Iowa actually said, disability is everywhere in history once we begin to actually look for it. And so I think one of the things that a disability studies perspective brings to the history of eugenics is a more nuanced rendering of the lives of those individuals who became the victims of eugenic legislation. When we look at the history of eugenics from a disability perspective, we can also begin to see, and I think tease out, and this will also become more apparent in the afternoon session, traces of eugenic thought in current debates around things such as prenatal screening, selective abortion, and other reproductive and genetic technologies and sciences. And Stephen may disagree with me, and we can argue about this or talk about this, but I think we can also see it in current social scientific and genetic research as well. Stephen was talking about certain courses and things ending in the 50s and 60s, and in fact they did in many ways, but they also simply got renamed. They're now called sociobiology or evolutionary psychology, and in some cases behavioral genetics. And so I think when we look from a disability studies perspective at the history of eugenics, we can see that eugenics hasn't really gone away. It hasn't ended. Too often eugenicists get dismissed or attacked, depending on your politics, as racist ideologues whose worldview and practices fell by the wayside in the wake of Nazi atrocities. This simply is not true. Yet when we look more carefully at the history of eugenics, we can see that eugenicists span the political spectrum, as I think all of our speakers have said this morning. And also that many eugenic measures were seen as progressive. They were seen as positive things. We can also, when we begin to incorporate, I think, gender and a disability studies perspective into the history of eugenics, we can see that eugenics rested and continues to rest upon the control of women's reproductive capacities and the elimination of so-called, quote, lives not worth living. Women around the world continue to undergo both, quote, voluntary and involuntary sterilization. And people with disabilities face the persistent threat of euthanasia, and also pregnant women continue to be pressured to abort fetuses that are considered to be potentially disabled, all in the name of the so-called new eugenics or neo-eugenics that Kluchin and other folks look at in the more recent work that's being done on eugenics. I think I'm going to keep it brief and end there.